The first time I visited my sister's new house was in October of 2019. She and her husband, Brendan, had just closed on a place in Coventry, Rhode Island, a 3-bedroom colonial set back from the road on about an acre of partially wooded land. She'd been sending pictures for weeks. New kitchen tile, the backyard in early autumn light, the little sun porch off the back that she kept calling her reading room. I was happy for her. She was 34, finally settled, and the place looked warm and real in the way that starter homes sometimes do, before the problems start showing. I drove up from New Haven on a Saturday morning. It was about a 2-hour drive, and I got there a little before noon. Brendan was at work. He managed a flooring warehouse in Warwick and often pulled half-days on weekends, so it was just Laura and me. She gave me the full tour. Upstairs bedrooms, the half-bath they wanted to redo, the basement that still had the previous owner's shelving bolted to the walls. Normal house stuff. I remember thinking it smelled like fresh paint and cardboard, and that particular chemical sweetness of new appliances still off-gassing. We had lunch on the sun porch, turkey sandwiches and iced tea. She talked about how quiet it was at night, how you could hear coyotes sometimes across the field behind the tree line. She told me about the neighbors, the older couple to the east, the Mitchells, who had brought over banana bread the day they moved in, and then the man on the other side. She didn't say his name right away. She said something like, "There's a guy to the west, lives alone, keeps to himself." I asked what he was like. She paused, and this is one of those details I've gone back to over and over. And she said, "He's fine. He's just around a lot." I didn't think much of it. In my mind, she was describing a retiree, someone who puttered around in his yard and maybe watched the street a little too much. I'd had neighbors like that. Everyone has. After lunch, I offered to help her hang some shelves in the guest bedroom, and while we were up there working, I happened to look out the window that faced west, toward the neighbor's property. The houses were maybe 60 feet apart, separated by a strip of lawn and a low chain-link fence that looked like it had been there for decades. His house was a smaller ranch-style, tan siding, neat yard, and he was standing in his driveway. He was just standing there, not doing anything, not holding anything. His hands were at his sides, and he was facing our direction. He was maybe 50, 55, average height, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt. I watched him for probably 10 seconds before Laura noticed what I was looking at. "Yeah," she said, "he does that." I laughed a little. I said something like, "Neighborhood watch, Captain?" She smiled, but it was flat. She went back to marking the wall for the shelf brackets, and I let it go. We finished the shelves around 3. I went downstairs to get some water, and when I passed the kitchen window, which also faced west, he was still there. Same spot, same posture, hands at his sides, facing our house. This time, something about it sat differently. Not because it was threatening. It wasn't. It was the stillness. People don't stand motionless in their own driveway for an hour. Not without a phone, not without a cigarette, not without leaning on something or shifting their weight. He looked like he was waiting, but not impatiently. It was the patience of it that bothered me. I almost said something to Laura, but I thought about how it would sound. Your neighbor is standing in his driveway, and it's creeping me out. She already knew. She'd already told me, and she'd moved on from it, in the way people move on from things they've decided aren't worth the energy. Brendan got home around 4:30. He was friendly, upbeat. We grilled chicken out back and ate on the patio as the sun started getting low. At some point, I glanced toward the west side of the yard. The neighbor was no longer in his driveway. His house was dark. Normal. Fine. I slept in the guest room that night. The bed was new and slightly too firm, and I remember lying there in the dark thinking about the house, about Laura seeming genuinely happy, about how adult it felt to visit your younger sister in a home she owned. I fell asleep around 11. I woke up at something like 2:15 in the morning. Not suddenly. It was a slow surfacing, like I'd been pulled up gradually. The room was dark. The house was silent, but there was a quality to the silence that felt active, like something had just stopped. I lay there for maybe a full minute, just listening. Nothing. I turned over and looked toward the window. The curtains were thin. Laura hadn't gotten around to replacing them, and moonlight was coming through in a pale wash. I could see the shape of the neighbor's house through the fabric, and then I saw the shape that wasn't the house, It was in the yard. Our yard. Between the houses, maybe 20 feet from my window. A person, standing still, facing the house. The proportions were right. Head, shoulders, the slight bulk of a torso. Not moving. My heart rate went up instantly. But I didn't move. I just stared at the shape through the curtain, trying to convince myself it was a shadow, a lawn ornament, a trick of the light. But I knew it wasn't. I knew it the way you know something is alive when you see it. Even in the dark, even through fabric, there is a density to a living body that nothing else replicates. I lay there for what I think was about 4 or 5 minutes, just watching. The shape didn't move. Not a shift, not a sway, just absolute stillness. And then, very slowly, it turned and walked back toward the neighbor's property. I watched it move along the fence line and disappear around the side of the ranch house. I didn't get up. I didn't wake Laura. I didn't check the doors. I lay in that bed and stared at the ceiling until the room started going gray with dawn. And then I got up and took a shower and went downstairs and made coffee like nothing had happened. This is the part I need you to understand, because this is the part that took me hours. I didn't get up. I didn't wake Laura. I didn't check the doors. I lay in that bed and stared at the ceiling until the room started going gray with dawn. And then I got up and took a shower and went downstairs and made coffee like nothing had happened. This is the part I need you to understand, because this is the part that took me hours. Over breakfast, I mentioned to Laura, casually, carefully, that I'd seen someone in the yard during the night. I expected her to be alarmed. I expected her to say, "Are you sure?" or, "That's never happened before." She said, "Was it around 2?" The air in the room changed, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, like she was confirming a bus schedule. I said yes, around 2. She nodded and took a sip of her coffee and said, "He does that a couple times a week. Brendan talked to him about it once. He said he has trouble sleeping and goes for walks. Brendan told him to stay on his own property and he said he would, but..." She shrugged. I didn't say anything for a long time. I was trying to assemble what she had just told me into something that made sense. A man who stands in his driveway for hours during the day, staring at their house. A man who crosses onto their property at 2 in the morning and stands in their yard, motionless, facing their windows. And my sister, my thoughtful, intelligent sister, was describing this to me in the same voice she'd used to describe the banana bread from the Mitchells. It took me the entire drive home to understand what I had actually witnessed that weekend. Not a quirky neighbor, not an eccentric loner. I had watched a man conducting surveillance on my sister's home. Patterned, repeated, escalating surveillance. Daytime observation to establish normalcy. Nighttime encroachment to test boundaries. And the most effective part of all, he had made it boring. He had done it so consistently and so passively that the people living next to him had simply absorbed it into the texture of their daily life. Laura wasn't ignoring it. She had been acclimated to it. There's a difference, and the difference is the entire point. I called her that evening. I tried to explain what I thought was happening. I used the word stalking. She got quiet, then said I was being dramatic. She said he was harmless, that Brendan had it handled, that I didn't understand because I didn't live there and see how mundane it actually was day to day. I called Brendan separately. He was less dismissive, but not by much. He said, "He's weird, but he's not dangerous. He's been here longer than us. It's his neighborhood too." I asked if they'd documented anything. He said no. I asked if they'd contacted the police. He said, "And say what? My neighbor stands in his own driveway?" I spent the next 2 months trying to get them to take it seriously. I sent articles about behavioral escalation patterns. I sent information about protective orders. Laura stopped responding to the articles. Brendan asked me politely to drop it. By Christmas, I had mostly stopped pushing, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I understood that I couldn't make them see what they had trained themselves not to see. In March of 2020, everything changed for different reasons. The lockdown started. I didn't visit for months. Laura and I talked on the phone, but the neighbor never came up. I assumed, hoped, that whatever it was had faded or resolved itself. In August of 2020, Laura called me on a Tuesday morning. She was crying, but controlled. She told me that 2 nights earlier, she had woken up at around 1:30 in the morning and gone downstairs to get water. The kitchen light was off. She walked past the sliding glass door that led to the back patio, and the neighbor was standing on the patio, not in the yard, on the patio. His face was about 2 feet from the glass. She said she screamed. She said Brendan came downstairs and the man was gone. They called the police. The police came, took a report, went next door. The man told the officers he'd heard a noise and come outside to check. The officers told Laura and Brendan there wasn't much they could do, based on one incident with no evidence of forced entry or criminal intent. Laura and Brendan installed cameras the next day. Over the following 3 weeks, the cameras captured the neighbor entering their yard on 4 separate occasions between midnight and 3 a.m. Twice he walked the perimeter of the house. Once he stood at the sliding glass door for 11 minutes. Once, and this is the one that still affects me, he tried the handle on the basement door. It was locked. He stood there for a moment after trying it, then walked back to his property. They took the footage to the police. There was a restraining order process. I don't know all the legal details, because Laura became very private about it. I know the man was eventually required to stay a certain distance from their property. I know Laura and Brendan sold the house in early 2021 at a loss and moved to an apartment in Cranston. I know Laura doesn't talk about the house in Coventry. Not ever. What took me hours to understand, what took me that entire drive back to New Haven, was that the danger had been completely visible the entire time. It was standing in the driveway at noon. It was standing in the yard at 2 in the morning. It never hid. The man never once tried to conceal what he was doing. And that was the thing that made it work. Because we are wired to believe that real threats are hidden, that danger comes from the dark, from behind, from the unexpected. We are not built to recognize a threat that presents itself openly, repeatedly, patiently, in broad daylight, and simply waits for you to stop noticing. Laura noticed, and then she stopped noticing. And the distance between those two things is where the actual danger lived. The second thing happened to me directly, and it took longer than hours. It took almost a full day before I understood it, and even now, I'm not sure I've understood it completely. In the summer of 2021, I was living in a different apartment in New Haven, a second-floor unit in a triple-decker near Edgewood Park. I had moved in that April. The building was old, but well-maintained. My landlord lived on the first floor. The third floor was occupied by a woman named Dina, who I rarely saw, and who, as far as I could tell, worked nights. I was between jobs at the time, doing freelance grant writing from home, which meant I was in the apartment for most of every day. It was a quiet building in a quiet neighborhood. The park was a block and a half away. I'd walk there in the mornings, get coffee at a place on Wally Avenue, come back and work until evening. Routine, predictable, comfortable. On a Wednesday, in mid-July, I think it was the 14th or 15th, I came home from my morning walk around 9:30. I unlocked the front door of the building, climbed the stairs, unlocked my apartment door, and went inside. Everything was normal. I made a second cup of coffee, sat down at my desk in the living room, and started working. Around 11, I got up to use the bathroom. The bathroom in that apartment was at the end of a short hallway off the bedroom. To get there, I had to walk through the bedroom, which I rarely entered during the day since I worked in the living room. I walked in, crossed toward the hallway, and something made me stop. The window in the bedroom was open. I need to be specific about this. The window was a double-hung window with a latch lock. I am certain, absolutely certain, that I had not opened it. I am not a person who opens bedroom windows. I've never been that person. I sleep with windows closed and locked. This is not a casual preference. It's something I've done my whole adult life. The latch was undone, and the lower sash was raised about 8 inches. The screen behind it was intact. I stood there, looking at it for probably 15 seconds. Then I closed it, locked it, and went to the bathroom. And here's the thing I need to be honest about. I didn't think much of it. I told myself that maybe I had opened it the night before and forgotten. Maybe there'd been a moment when the apartment felt stuffy, and I'd done it without thinking. It was July. It was hot. It was possible. I accepted the explanation because it was available. I went back to work. The day continued. Nothing else was out of place. The next morning, Thursday, I did my walk, came home, made coffee, sat down to work. Around noon, I went to the kitchen to make lunch. I opened the silverware drawer and something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. The drawer felt different. I looked down at it. The forks and knives were in the wrong sections. In my apartment, I kept forks on the left, knives in the middle, spoons on the right. I know this is mundane. I know most people don't memorize the layout of their silverware drawer. But I had lived alone for 3 years by that point, and when you live alone, your systems become fixed. They become almost unconscious architecture. Forks on the left. Always. And now the forks were in the middle and the knives were on the left. I stood there with the drawer open, staring at it. I rearranged it back to the correct order. And I told myself, once again, that I must have emptied the dishwasher carelessly at some point and mixed them up. Reasonable. Plausible. Done. Friday I didn't notice anything unusual. Saturday I didn't either. By Sunday, I had completely forgotten about the window and the silverware. They had been absorbed. Filed under things that were slightly weird but meant nothing. The following Wednesday, I came home from my walk and found a dining chair pulled about 2 feet away from the table. Not knocked over. Not out of place in a dramatic way. Just pulled out, as if someone had been sitting in it and stood up without pushing it back in. I lived alone. I had not sat at that table the night before. I'd eaten on the couch watching television. I was sure of it. This one stuck with me a little longer. I pushed the chair back in and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking around. Everything else was exactly where it should be. The door had been locked when I came home. The windows were closed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. I checked the whole apartment, bedroom, bathroom, closet, the small storage space off the kitchen. Empty. Normal. I told myself the building was old and the floors were slightly uneven. Maybe the chair had shifted on its own. I'd heard of that. Vibrations from trucks on the street, the settling of old wood framing. Sure. Okay. But something had started building in the back of my mind. Not fear exactly. More like a pattern recognition that hadn't fully resolved. 3 small things in 10 days. Each one individually meaningless. Together, they formed a shape I wasn't ready to look at. The following Friday night, I went out with a friend. We had dinner on Chapel Street and I got back around 11. I remember fumbling with my keys at the front door, going upstairs, walking into the apartment. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and went to the bedroom to change. The closet door was open. It was a sliding door, the kind that runs on a track, and I always kept it closed. Not just pushed to, but closed and seated fully in the track. It was open about 1.5 feet. I could see my clothes hanging inside in the dark. I felt cold. Real cold. Not the metaphorical chill people describe in stories. I mean my body temperature dropped. My arms went tight. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom and I did not want to go inside. I made myself do it. I checked the closet, checked behind the door, checked the bathroom, checked every room. Nothing. No one. I locked the apartment door. I checked every window. All locked. I sat on the couch in the living room and did not sleep in my bed that night. The next morning, Saturday, I went downstairs and knocked on my landlord's door. His name was Gerald. He was in his 60s, a retired machinist, widowed. Good guy. Quiet. I asked him, as casually as I could, whether anyone had been in my apartment recently. Maintenance, exterminator, anyone. He said no. I asked if anyone else had a key to my unit. He said he had a spare for emergencies, kept in a lockbox in his apartment. No one else. I asked him, and I remember choosing my words carefully, whether the building had ever had any issues with break-ins. He said no, never. It was a safe street. He'd lived there since 1994. I thanked him and went back upstairs. I spent most of the day in the apartment, working, but also watching. Watching my own space. Looking at it the way you look at a room in someone else's house. Trying to see it fresh. Trying to see what I'd been missing. That night, around 8, I was sitting at my desk when I heard a sound from above. From the 3rd floor. Dina's apartment. It was a thump, not loud, not alarming. The kind of sound that a person makes moving through a space. Footstep. Chair leg. Something dropped. But I realized, sitting there listening, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard Dina. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her. I'd been in the apartment nearly every day for 3 months, and I could not conjure a single memory of hearing her come or go in at least the last several weeks. I checked the mailboxes the next morning. Her box was full. Not just a few days of mail. It was packed. I told Gerald. I told him Dina's mail was overflowing and I hadn't seen her in weeks. His face did something complicated, not alarm, but a kind of resigned awareness, like I had confirmed something he'd been avoiding. He said he'd check on her. He went upstairs. I heard him knock. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He came back down and told me he'd try to reach her by phone. I went back to my apartment. That afternoon, Gerald came to my door. He told me he'd reached Dina's emergency contact, her mother in Bridgeport. Dina had been hospitalized in late June. A psychiatric episode. She'd been in a facility for almost 3 weeks and then moved in with her mother. She had not been back to the apartment since June 22nd. June 22nd. Nearly a month before the window. Before the silverware. Before the chair. Before the closet. I said this to Gerald. I said, "Then who's been in the building?" His face changed. He went upstairs with his keys and entered Dina's apartment. I stood at the bottom of the stairwell and listened. I heard him walk through the rooms. I heard him open doors. I heard him stop. He came back down slowly. He looked pale. He told me that someone had been living in Dina's apartment. There was a sleeping bag on the floor of the bedroom. Food wrappers. Water bottles. A backpack with clothes in it. The window in Dina's kitchen, which faced the fire escape, was unlocked and showed marks on the frame consistent with it being pried open from outside. Someone had entered the building through the 3rd floor. They'd been living above me, in an apartment everyone assumed was occupied by its tenant. And at some point, probably multiple points, they had come downstairs. I want to stay precise here because the precision matters. The police came. They processed Dina's apartment. They found fingerprints that didn't match Dina's. They found evidence that someone had been occupying the space for an estimated 2 to 3 weeks based on the accumulation of waste. They found no evidence of who that person was. No identification in the backpack. The clothes were generic. The food wrappers were from a convenience store that didn't have functioning security cameras. What the police could not determine, and what I could not determine, was whether the person had entered my apartment. There was no forensic investigation of my unit. There was no reason for one. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been damaged, no one had been harmed. The small disturbances I described, the window, the silverware, the chair, the closet, were not evidence of anything, legally. They were not even, in the official sense, events. But I knew. I knew the way Laura had known, somewhere underneath the knowing, about her neighbor in Coventry. I knew that someone had been coming into my apartment while I was out on my morning walks. Someone who had a route, fire escape to 3rd floor to stairwell, stairwell to my door, which I now realized I sometimes left unlocked during short outings because the building felt safe and Gerald was always downstairs. Someone who opened a window. Moved the silverware. Sat in my chair. Opened my closet. Not to take anything. Not to do anything I could point to. Just to be there, to exist in my space. To touch my things and put them back slightly wrong. It took me most of that day, from the moment Gerald came down from Dina's apartment to the moment I lay in bed that night in a building I no longer trusted, to understand what had actually been happening. Not the facts. The facts were simple. But the understanding, the full, felt understanding that another person had been moving through my home while I slept, while I worked, while I lived my quiet, boring, routine life, that came in slowly, like water through a crack. And once it was in, it didn't leave. I broke my lease. Gerald didn't fight it. I think he understood. I moved to a different part of the city, a building with a security door and a deadbolt and no fire escape. I lock my door now when I walk to the end of the block. I check my windows when I come home. I look at my things, the silverware, the chairs, the closets, with a kind of forensic attention that I know is not normal and that I cannot stop. The person was never identified. The sleeping bag and the backpack were taken into evidence and, as far as I know, are still in a property room somewhere. Dina never came back for her things. Gerald sold the building the following year. Sometimes I think about the thump I heard from the third floor that Saturday night, while I sat at my desk in the new awareness that something was wrong. That sound I interpreted as a footstep, a chair leg, something dropped. And I think about how I had been hearing sounds like that for weeks, small, ordinary, domestic sounds from the apartment above, and how I had never once questioned them. Because there was supposed to be someone up there. Because the explanation already existed before the question did. That's how it works. That's what took me so long to understand. The most disturbing thing in the world is not a locked door with something behind it. It's an open door you've been walking past every day because you assumed it was supposed to be open. The last thing I want to tell you about happened to a friend of mine. His name is Marcus, and he gave me permission to share this, although he asked me to leave out certain details that could identify the other people involved. I'll respect that. Marcus is an EMT. He's been working in emergency medical services in Hartford, Connecticut, for about 7 years. He's seen the full range of what that job puts in front of you: cardiac events, overdoses, car accidents, violence. He's steady, clinical, not someone who rattles easily. I've known him since college and I have never seen him shaken by a call. Not until this one. In the fall of 2022, Marcus and his partner, I'll call her Yvette, were dispatched to a residential address for a welfare check assist. The police had already been called by a neighbor who reported not having seen the elderly resident in several days. The officers arrived first, made entry, and requested EMS. That's standard when they find someone who might need medical attention. Marcus and Yvette arrived to find 2 officers standing on the front porch of a small single-story house in a residential neighborhood. It was mid-afternoon, clear weather. The house was tidy from the outside. Small front yard, chain-link fence, an American flag on a bracket by the door. One of the officers told Marcus that the resident was an 81-year-old man, lived alone, and they'd found him sitting in a recliner in the living room. He was alive, conscious, and responsive but appeared confused and possibly dehydrated. They wanted EMS to evaluate him before deciding whether transport was necessary. Marcus went inside. The house was dim, curtains drawn, one lamp on in the living room. It smelled like old food and something stale underneath. The man was where the officers said he'd be, in a worn recliner facing a television that was on but muted. He was thin, wearing a flannel shirt and pajama pants. His eyes were open. He looked at Marcus when he walked in. Marcus introduced himself, asked the man his name. The man gave it. Marcus asked if he knew what day it was. The man said Saturday. It was Tuesday. Marcus asked if he had any pain. The man said no. Marcus took his vitals. Blood pressure was low. Heart rate slightly elevated. Temperature normal. The man was dehydrated but not critically. His pupils were responsive. His speech was slow but coherent. Marcus introduced himself, asked the man his name. The man gave it. Marcus asked if he knew what day it was. The man said Saturday. It was Tuesday. Marcus asked if he had any pain. The man said no. Marcus took his vitals. Blood pressure was low. Heart rate slightly elevated. Temperature normal. The man was dehydrated but not critically. His pupils were responsive. His speech was slow but coherent. Yvette stayed with the man while Marcus did a quick walkthrough of the house, which is standard for assessing the patient's living conditions and determining if adult protective services should be notified. Kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, back hallway. The kitchen was the problem. The refrigerator was nearly empty, a carton of milk that had expired 2 weeks earlier, some condiments, a package of deli meat that Marcus didn't open but could smell. The trash can was full. The sink had dishes in it, but not an overwhelming number, maybe 3 or 4 days worth. On the kitchen counter, there was a pill organizer, the kind with a compartment for each day of the week. This is common in elderly patients who manage multiple medications. Marcus looked at it. The compartments were labeled Monday through Sunday. It was Tuesday, and the Tuesday compartment was empty. So were Mondays and Sundays. That tracked. But then Marcus noticed that Thursdays and Fridays were also empty. And Saturdays only had 1 pill in it, when the other days that were still full, Wednesday, had 4 pills each. This was something Marcus flagged mentally but didn't focus on in the moment. Medication compliance in elderly patients is complicated. People forget. People double dose. People mix up the days. He made a note. He went back to the living room. The man was talking to Yvette now, more animated than before. He was telling her about his daughter. How she came by every few days to bring groceries and check on him. How she was a good girl. How she worked hard. He said she'd brought him soup recently. He couldn't remember when, but he remembered the soup. Chicken noodle. Marcus and Yvette made the decision to transport. The man was dehydrated, his medication compliance was unclear, and he was disoriented about the day and date. They helped him onto the stretcher. He was cooperative. On the way to the ambulance, one of the officers pulled Marcus aside and said something that Marcus almost didn't register at the time. The officer said, "The neighbor who called it in, she says the daughter hasn't been around in over a month." Marcus heard it. He acknowledged it. He filed it somewhere in the working part of his mind and continued loading the patient. On the ride to the hospital, the man talked more. He talked about his daughter. He said her name. He described what she looked like. He told a story about taking her fishing when she was 9. He said she always brought him soup when he was feeling low. He said she'd been by just the other day. At the hospital, Marcus completed the handoff. Standard documentation, standard transfer of care. He noted the dehydration, the confusion, the medication irregularity, the living conditions. In the comments section, he wrote that the patient repeatedly referenced a daughter who, per a neighbor, had not visited in over a month. He recommended social work follow-up. Marcus and Yvette cleared the hospital and took their next call. A fender bender on I-84. Then a diabetic emergency in the South End. Then a transport from a nursing facility. By the time their shift ended at 11 p.m., Marcus had mostly stopped thinking about the old man in the recliner. He went home. He ate. He sat on his couch for a while doing nothing, which is something he does after shifts to let the day drain out. And at some point, sitting there in his own living room, something began to surface. He started thinking about the pill organizer. Tuesday, Monday, and Sunday were empty. That tracked with the current day and the 2 days before. But Thursday and Friday were also empty. And Saturday had only 1 pill when it should have had 4. If the man had been taking his own medication in order, the empty days should have been consecutive and recent. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. But Thursday and Friday were empty too, with a mostly empty Saturday between them and a full Wednesday after them. The pattern didn't make sense for a man taking his own pills. You don't skip Wednesday, take Thursday, take Friday, take 1 pill on Saturday, and then resume on Sunday. Unless someone else was managing the pills. Marcus sat with this for a while. He thought about the daughter. The daughter who came by every few days. The daughter who brought soup. The daughter who, according to the man, had been there recently. The daughter who, according to the neighbor, hadn't been there in over a month. He thought about the empty refrigerator. The expired milk. The 3 or 4 days of dishes in the sink. The man's disorientation. His thinness. And then he thought about something he'd noticed but hadn't consciously processed during the walkthrough. On the kitchen counter, next to the pill organizer, there had been a checkbook. It was open. Not just sitting there, open, with a pen beside it. As if someone had been writing in it recently. An 81-year-old man who didn't know what day it was. Who thought his daughter had visited yesterday. Who was sitting in a dark house with no food and dry water glasses. And on his counter, an open checkbook with a pen. Marcus told me he sat on his couch for a long time that night. He said the understanding didn't come as a single moment. It came in pieces, and each piece was worse than the last. The daughter was coming. Maybe not every few days, but she was coming. She was coming to take pills out of the organizer to make it look like her father was being medicated. She was coming to sit at his counter and write checks. She was not bringing groceries. She was not bringing soup. The soup the old man remembered, the chicken noodle, that might have been weeks old. A memory he was clinging to because it was the last real act of care he could recall. Marcus didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he called the hospital and asked to speak to the social worker assigned to the case. He explained what he'd observed and what he'd pieced together. The social worker thanked him and said they would look into it. Marcus never found out what happened. That's how EMS works. You deliver the patient, you file the report, and the story continues without you. There is no follow-up, no closure, no ending. You carry the fragment and that's all you get. But what Marcus described to me, sitting on his couch at midnight, replaying the walkthrough of that kitchen in his mind, watching the details rearrange themselves into something monstrous, that is the version of this experience that has stayed with me the most. Because Marcus didn't miss anything. He saw the pill organizer. He saw the checkbook. He saw the empty refrigerator. He noted all of it. And in the context of the call, welfare check, elderly patient, dehydration, transport, every detail had an explanation that fit. Elderly man, lives alone, struggling to care for himself, case closed. The truth was underneath the reasonable explanation like a second floor plan. Same house. Same rooms. Completely different architecture. A daughter who was not caring for her father but had not stopped visiting. A daughter who was managing something, just not his health. An old man in a recliner who believed, sincerely believed, that he was loved and looked after, because the person doing this to him was the same person he trusted most. It took Marcus hours to understand what he had walked through. And what bothered him most, what still bothers him when he talks about it, is not the cruelty. It's the neatness. The way everything was arranged to look like neglect, like an old man slipping through the cracks of a system that doesn't pay enough attention. When in fact someone was paying very close attention. Just not to him. I think about these 3 experiences more than I should. My sister's neighbor, my apartment in New Haven, Marcus, and the man in the recliner. They're different situations involving different people in different places, and the danger in each one came from a completely different source. But the thing they share, the thing that connects them in my mind and that I keep coming back to, is the gap. The gap between seeing and understanding. Between noticing and knowing. Between something being visible and something being recognized for what it actually is. In every case, the information was there. The evidence was present. The answer was available. But understanding required a kind of cognitive shift that doesn't happen in real time, because in real time we are inside the story, and inside the story, the most available explanation is almost always the most comfortable one. The neighbor is eccentric. I must have opened the window myself. The old man is just having a hard time. These aren't lies we tell ourselves. They're the truth as we experience it in the moment. The real truth, the one underneath, takes hours because it requires you to dismantle the version of events you've already built and live in. And no one does that willingly. No one looks at a day they've already made sense of and says, what if none of my explanations were right? What if the thing I'm not seeing is the thing that matters most? That's what took me so long. Every time. Not a lack of information. A surplus of false comfort. And the worst part, the part one still haven't fully made peace with, is that I don't know how many times it's happened and I never made the shift at all. How many open windows I closed without thinking. How many small wrongnesses I corrected and forgot. How many times the understanding was right there, waiting for me, and I just walked past it because the easier explanation was already in place. I don't know. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night. Not what I eventually understood, what I might still be missing,